Everyone. Greetings and welcome to the second Africa-China Initiative webinar of Spring 2026. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Yoon Park. I'm an adjunct professor in the African Studies program at Georgetown University and the program director of the Africa-China Initiative. Just to confirm that you've joined the correct Zoom, we're here for the third and final part of a series featuring early career African scholars presenting new research on Africa-China engagements and their impacts on peace and security. All of the research in this series and the researchers were supported by the former United States Institute for Peace, and today's webinar will focus on South Africa-China military cooperation. I'm here to introduce our speakers and moderate the Q&A that will follow. We hope that you'll be able to remain with us throughout the next 90 minutes, but just in case you need to jump off before the conclusion of the event, please allow me to start with a few thank yous. First of all, the ACI is generally supported by the Henry Luce Foundation, which has funded us from our inception over 3 years ago. We thank them for their generous and kind support. Secondly, thank you to our primary host, the African Studies program, and especially Professor Laura Smith for always having our backs. Thank you also to the Asian Studies Department and our event series co-hosts, the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues at Georgetown and Howard University Center for African Studies. And finally, thank you to Eleanor Albert of the U.S.-China Dialogue, and especially to our ACI program assistant, Brennan Young, without whom none of these events would take place. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers and the discussants for this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them now in the order in which they're going to speak. First up is going to be Henry Tugendhat. He will provide preliminary remarks. Henry is currently the Sora Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, focused on Chinese activities in North Africa and the Middle East. But prior to this, he served as the Africa-China Project Director at USIP, which again funded and supported the research that will be presented today. After Henry's brief introductory remarks, we're going to hear from our early career scholars. Keenan Govender is an independent research consultant who's recently returned to the UK from South Africa, and Shannon Whitaker, who's currently at the Gauteng City Regional Observatory, that's part of the University of the Witwatersrand. Finally, our discussants are Emmanuel Matombo, based at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, and Cobus van Staden of the China Global South Project. For full disclosure, both Cobus and I served as members of the Research Advisory Committee of the USIP's Africa-China Project. Henry will speak for about 10 minutes. Shannon and Keenan will present their research, and I've given them about 20 minutes to do this. And then each of the discussants will have up to 10 minutes for their remarks. That means that we'll have at least 15 to 20 minutes for at least one round of questions. We ask that you use the Q&A tab at the bottom to type out your questions, and I'll read them aloud at the end. With that, let me hand over to Henry. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Yoon, and thank you so much for hosting today's event. It's really just so wonderful that we were able to finish this excellent project just in time before, unfortunately, the US Institute for Peace was closed down, because this was the second iteration of a project that was designed to fund and mentor early career scholars from across the African continent doing original fieldwork and research on Chinese engagements in their respective countries. And the thinking behind this was twofold. On the one hand, it was just obvious to us that the conversation about Chinese engagements in Africa was often dominated by either Chinese voices or Western voices, but very often there was a lack of African voices, especially up and coming researchers in this space. And so we really wanted to be able to fund that and support those views, those opinions, people who had those networks, those languages, those on the ground views, but also obviously the experience of working in this field. And the second thinking behind this was also that peace and security is often an overlooked subject in this space. There's been so much more research on Chinese lending and Chinese funding and Chinese trade across the continent and the continent's relationship with China on those fields, but far less on peace and security. And we thought that this mattered because in a time of heightened geopolitical tensions, having objective fact-based research is important to lower the temperature when so many narratives are flying back and forth based on people's opinions and conjecture. And so in this age of AI and language models and everything else where we worry about people being able to produce research out of nothing, I personally hold faith that this is really the last bastion of research, which is fieldwork-based research. It's something that AI cannot recreate from nothing in the way that real conversations, real in-depth time spent on a subject area and observing and interacting can create wholly new understandings and meaningful contributions in this space. So I want to thank obviously our research advisors for having led these great projects. It was Ewan and Kobus and Lena Ben Abdallah and Obed Hodzi. But then, of course, most of all, our research cohorts, our researchers themselves. And so Keenan and Shannon are actually presenting as the last of these research teams, but absolutely by no means the least, because they've got really fantastic work on Chinese-South African military cooperation that they spend a lot of time doing interviews on and thinking on and writing about, and this is really the latest culmination of a long process of research and analysis. So thank you to you both, and I'll hand over to you both, right? Or do I hand over to Emmanuel?
Keenan and Shannon are going to present.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Dr. Park. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to those of us not in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you all for being here today. Let me especially say thank you to Georgetown University and the ACI and other partners for the platform today. Of course, as introduced, my name is Keenan Govender, and I'm joined by my colleague and my co-author, Shannon Whitaker. We're really excited to share the findings of our research with you today. Of course, the title of our paper is Golden Era of Collaboration, a critical analysis of South Africa-China defense diplomacy. Our research critically examines South Africa-China defense diplomacy and the dynamics of power and influence within this strategic relationship. When we started this research, we started with a key question or idea in our head, and that was, does South Africa's evolving defense diplomacy with China impact its peace and security objectives in Africa? But, however, as we progressed, we realized that this question assumed a one-way relationship, that is, of China influencing South Africa. Instead, and through the course of our study, we found that South Africa is not merely a passive recipient of China's defense diplomacy, but rather it is an active participant in shaping that relationship through its own influence and strategies. So as South Africa navigates its non-aligned foreign policy, the question that remains at the top of our heads is, can it maintain its strategic autonomy, or is it being drawn further into China's sphere of influence? And I believe that our findings would shed some light on this pressing issue. So our presentation today will proceed in three key areas. I will first speak to the historical evolution of South Africa-China military relations. And then Shannon will then speak to the theoretical framework we developed to understand how influence works in this relationship, as well as the research methodology that we used. And then we'll speak to some of the key findings on who influences whom, the risks and opportunities in this engagement, and what it means for South Africa in the future. So I think if we can go to the next, to the next slide of the next slide of the research question. So we had these two research questions that really informed our thinking and how we approached the research. And that was firstly, how does defense diplomacy act as an instrument of soft power in relations between states? And then to what extent does South Africa use defense diplomacy as a soft power instrument to balance its relationships with China? And I think a good starting point would be to look at how South Africa-China defense ties have evolved over time. So if we can go to the next slide. So to fully grasp the nature of this fledgling relationship, it's important to understand how these ties have evolved through time. And I will try my best to do this, quite concisely and share just some key milestones that you'll also see on the slide. I think it's important to note that formal diplomatic relations were established between Pretoria and Beijing in 1998, and this really was the turning point for the strategic engagement. So some of the key milestones, of course, include the 2000 Pretoria Declaration. This established a strategic partnership that was based on mutual respect and then regional security. The Pretoria Declaration then culminated in the first Defense Committee meeting in 2003, which really created a structured platform for high-level military discussions between the two states. Through the course of our fieldwork, many of the former officers that we spoke to from the South African Navy specifically raised that 2008 and the visit of SAS Speenkop to Shanghai was really a integral moment in South Africa-China diplomatic defense diplomacy. And of course, it was also, the first time in history that an African warship was to dock in China. If we then go forward some years, in 2019, exercise MOSI-1 was the first trilateral naval exercise with Russia, China, and South Africa, and really signaled this deeper security cooperation. In 2023, exercise MOSI-2 was, of course, a continuation of these joint drills and really reinforced the commitment to maritime security as well as interoperability. Then moving forward to more recent events, in 2024, there was the Peace Ark visit in which a Chinese military hospital ship conducted a humanitarian exercise in Cape Town, really served to showcase China's use of soft power in defense relations. And then in 2025, we came to know of Project Zingisa, which was a multi-million rand upgrade to the SANDF base, that is South African National Defence Force, of course, base De Brugge, which we found out was being led by foreign specialists from China and formed part of a military aid agreement signed with China during bilateral meetings in 2024. That is both in Beijing and Pretoria, respectively. And then most recently, in January of this year, January of 2026, we saw exercise MOSI-3, which became known as Wolf for Peace, as this naval exercise was led by China, however, in South African territorial waters. And of course, this included members of the BRICS Plus grouping, which included China, Russia, and Iran. So these milestones really highlight a steady deepening of military cooperation, we believe. However, as we will discuss later in our presentation, this relationship is more complex than it appears. And it really raises questions about who truly benefits from these engagements and how South Africa can strategically position itself to avoid dependency on China. And of course, then to analyze this, we had to develop a theoretical framework that went beyond traditional views of military diplomacy. And Shannon will now speak to how we approach this and the research methodology that we used.
Thanks, Keenan. Hello, everyone. So our research was qualitative. As Keenan's already mentioned, we gathered our primary data through semi-structured interviews, either with former SANDF members or Navy members, security experts, international affairs scholars. So we tried to get a diverse view. And then we also did a lot of desktop research. And the idea here was scanning policy documents from the South African side, as well as grey literature, official statements, statements from defense attaches, whatever you can think of as grey literature. We looked at it. And then what we did is that we did a manual reflexive thematic analysis. So we read through both our transcripts, or all our transcripts first, trying to identify different patterns, how this relationship formed, and the idea behind the different ways that influence was exchanged between the two countries through defense diplomacy. And then we applied those themes to the grey literature. And then we did that iterative reading over and over again to get an idea of what we were looking at. So you'll see we tried to use an Afrocentric approach. So this was both normative in the sense that we're both young South Africans. We're both believe that the African agent needs to be acknowledged a lot in this relationship and in this form of research. But then this was also pragmatic. We really struggled to be very honest, to get any kind of Chinese perspective on the relationship. So it worked out for us because it was our normative position, but it is a huge limitation to our research. Next slide, please. So what you'll see here is basically the start of the theoretical framework. And what we found in our reading of the literature is that when scholars spoke about defense diplomacy, it tended to be more of a descriptive list of activities that happen between states, whether it's military exercises, military aid, how many training sessions have they done. And instead of really then investigating military diplomacy as an instrument of statecraft, which is where we get to. So following on from Winger, who in a conference paper in 2014 put forward a different definition, which moved beyond just a descriptive list, where he defined defense diplomacy as the peaceful use of the defense instruments of one country to co-opt the government institutions of another country in order to achieve a preferred outcome. So what he kind of laid the ground for was using terminology that we're quite familiar with in IR, specifically Nye's work on soft power. And what he did is he created this framework, which I've included here. So this belongs to Winger. And basically he explains that military statecraft uses coercive power, so hard power, obviously, incentive power, economic power, and then soft co-optive power or soft power, which could either be indirect or direct. So what we did is now we're focusing on co-optive power on the right, defense diplomacy, and the direct method. However, we felt that this was just a bit limited and that we could add on to this. Next slide, please. So what we decided to do is that you'll notice from Winger's definition is that he speaks about the relationship of one state trying to influence another state through defense diplomacy in such a way that it's quite linear and it's moving along a one-way street. And because we're looking at this from the South African position, this obviously wasn't going to suit us because it would then limit us to only looking at China's role in this relationship. So what we decided to do is then we had to like expand how we were going to think about this. And ultimately, what that came down to was really getting into the nuts and bolts of what influence is, if it's through defense diplomacy, and if it's not just a list of activities. And we lent on leadership literature, on social influence to develop a taxonomy of power bases from which states then draw on to influence others in their defense diplomacy activities. So we then we don't want, as I said, we didn't want to frame the relationship in a unilateral way, and this allowed us to look at it in a different way. Adding to that, because we had this taxonomy of power bases, which then states draw from as sort of like a military chest, if you will, we also understood that this could then exist on different levels. So you'll see in the graphic, we have interpersonal, which are person-to-person exchanges, which really came through from the participants, as well as discursive, how states frame their activities with one another, and then on the international level, speaking to the broader climate. Next slide, please. So it's not an exhaustive list. As you'll see, we used French and Raven's list from the leadership literature, and we came up with a list of power bases from which we felt that this relationship was formed. So the one is referent power, which is very important, and it'll appear again and again in this discussion, which is about mutual respect, expert power, which is specialized knowledge, resource power, which is quite self-explanatory, so it's economic and military strength, reward power is incentives, and connection power. We added connection power, and we added connection power to the taxonomy because we felt that this was an additional thing within the relationship that was very important. It's really important to also realize that the power bases are interdependent, they're intertwined. The strength of one is deeply dependent on another. And when one is fickle, the others also begin to collapse. So what we found from our research, which we'll get into a bit later, but overall, China predominantly relies on referent power in its relationship with South Africa, and likewise, South Africa also relies on referent power and expert power in its relationship with China. However, this may change in the future. Next slide, please. I think this is Keenan now.
Thanks, Shan. So yeah, I will now speak to the findings of our research insofar as South Africa's defense diplomacy is used as soft power. So in our analysis revealed three main findings about the exchange of influence in this relationship. And I'll try to present these findings quite briefly and concisely, but I'd hope at some stage, once our paper is published, you'll be able to read it at a bit more in depth. I'll start with China's strategic approach, which I think kind of differs from our slides. But I think it's important to start with China's strategic approach first and foremost, beyond military aid. So unlike other African states that rely on Chinese military aid, equipment, and training, South Africa does not depend on China in the same way. Instead, as Shannon mentioned, China really uses and leverages its referent power base and positions itself as an equal partner to South Africa, and really leverages diplomatic narratives to promote its interests. So in China's reliance on this referent power base, it normally frames its engagements as win-win cooperation or international reform to align South Africa within its broader geopolitical vision. And this becomes really evident if one analyzes the language used in bilateral agreements and high-level meetings. However, one of our participants noted, and I'll quote them, South Africa gives China legitimacy in Africa. It's not just about Beijing influencing us, it's also about how China benefits from our status as a regional leader. So, of course, this manifests in high-level military visits and security dialogues, and strategic cooperation to reinforce a sense of mutuality. But of course, on China's part, with clear geopolitical objectives. And then the second part, in looking at South Africa's agency or South Africa's soft power strategy, South Africa is not entirely passive in this relationship, as previously mentioned, but it also uses its referent power, using its status as a peace-building leader, as well as our own democratic transition experience, to engage China on its own terms, on South Africa's own terms. South Africa also relies on its connection power. That is, as Shannon mentioned, acting as a bridge, often between China and African security frameworks, particularly in the African Union Peace and Security Council, and then now increasingly in the BRICS Plus grouping. However, and we believe this to be really significant, South Africa's declining military capacity, especially in peacekeeping operations, really weakens its leverage and makes it harder for South Africa to sustain its own strategic autonomy. One security analyst that we spoke to during our field work, he warned, and I'll quote, "We love to talk about peacekeeping, but the SANDF is overstretched and underfunded. And influence without capability is empty." So moving to the third challenge. Next slide, please. Great. The third challenge is one that we kind of looked at as the challenge of non-alignment. Of course, South Africa faces a lot of pressure in balancing military ties with China, as well as diplomatic relations with the West, especially as South Africa maintains this non-aligned foreign policy. However, closer defense ties with China risk undermining this balance, and we recognize that as Western partners increasingly view South Africa as shifting towards China's geopolitical orbit. And as we mentioned before, South Africa's connection power relies on being able to reinforce and initiate ties via its navy, and in its expert power through its struggle to fulfill its peacekeeping mandate on the continent. But the long-term sustainability of this, and especially of the non-alignment, is now in question. So in essence, South Africa is both a recipient and a practitioner of soft power in its defense ties with China. But what we found is that its ability to exert influence is becoming increasingly constrained. So I'll hand over back to Shannon, who will speak to some of the challenges and power imbalances and then conclude for us today. Thank you.
So this slide really just acts to summarize what Keenan has discussed in the findings. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but really the idea is that if we look at these different points, we can understand how the power-based framework comes into play. So South Africa's declining military capacity, meaning its resource power, is then limited, which then limits in turn its ability to leverage its referent power. And that not only influences its ability to use its defense diplomacy to its advantage in its relationship with China, but increasingly so with other African states, as we've seen. This also then creates another feedback loop, because one of South Africa's referent and expert power bases is that it is an expert on the continent. So as those relationships deter, so does its strategic positioning with China. And then moving on, China's geopolitical ambitions continue to grow, making it harder for South Africa to maintain an equal footing. Obviously, as a middle power, this is a very obvious point. And then the strategic balancing act, so maintaining our non-aligned position while also deepening the defense ties with China. It's difficult and it's risky. Next slide, please. So overall, this is the main idea that we want to convey is when we look at the theoretical framework and how we apply it to the defense diplomacy activities of these two countries, what we see is that resource, reward, and connection power have facilitated a very strong degree of neutrality. But what undergirded all of this is the two countries' use of what we're calling referent power, which is the two countries' reinforcement of their rhetorical positioning, which formed a deep sense of trust. It's interesting that a lot of this has happened through the defense, through the defense diplomacy, as well as through the traditional foreign officers. So it does show that this defense diplomacy is an additional tool for building that referent power between these two countries. What's also interesting is that the research shows that when a country relies on referring on power bases that are external, so for example, coercion or reward or resources, those are situational, and the motivation to accept that influence is also situational. Whereas something that is based in referent power is much more intrinsic because there's trust there. So our argument is that although this relationship is rhetorical and therefore a lot of the white noise around it is maybe not warranted, it does signal a level of a movement towards trust that did not exist before the relationship kind of got into gear before 2008. So when looking into the future, it will be necessary for South Africa to invest in its in the SANDF and in the defense industry. And our latest budget, which happened this week, suggests that our government has no intention of doing that, which is a bit of a risky thing. Then we also need to manage our strategic partnerships, which I'm sure will come through in the discussion later, because there's a lot of critical awareness about whether we do this well enough or not. And leading into that about clarifying our alignment strategy. Thank you. I think that's all we have for you today. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Keenan and Shannon. Let me now turn over to Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Professor Park, and thank you very much to the colleagues as well. Thanks for the kind invitation once again, Prof, and I hope you have been well. And congratulations to the two scholars, Keenan and Shannon, and I look forward to reading the paper once it has been published. So just make a few comments on the research itself, and then afterwards, and then I might give some questions probably that the two authors would deign to ponder. The first part I'm going to say will relate to what Henry said in his introduction, that one of the reasons for coming up with this very important program that our scholars benefited from was that Africa has always had a muted voice, so to say, when it comes to its relationship with China. The same, Henry, is the case as well with our African countries. Sometimes they have really been taken as passengers rather than countries that are able to exercise agency as they relate to the People's Republic of China. South Africa being a case in point as well. And South Africa, comparatively speaking, when looked at in the context of the African continent, fares even much better because of issues such as debt, because most of South Africa's debt is actually owed to its domestic creditors, whilst the rest of the continent, countries such as Angola, Zambia, the People's Democratic Republic of Congo, are very much dependent on Chinese debt. So their agency is diminished even further than whatever one would want to attribute to South Africa's relationship with China. Coming to the defense diplomacy, by the way, I really like the framework that you used, Keenan and Shannon. I should confess that I have not read defense diplomacy with any appreciable depth that would allow me to speak with authority, but you have just sparked interest in me and I'll read further on it. So coming to what China has been, the exercises that China has been doing with South Africa, This could be traced, first of all, to China's naval ambitions, South Africa being a littoral country, obviously. And in the recent past, this could be traced to the difficulties that China had around 2011 with the Libyan revolution, when China had to depend on Greece to a considerable degree, on Greece, Malta, and Tunisia to evacuate and then host about 38,000 Chinese nationals. 29,000 eventually went to China after obviously being taken to third countries. But that was quite a wake-up call for the People's Republic of China, that it would have to bolster its naval ambitions, its naval presence, not only in Africa, by the way, but also in China's neighborhood. The same happened 3 years later in the same country of Greece, in the same country of Libya, sorry, when China was forced to evacuate about 900 workers when a civil war erupted in Libya. So all those things are kind of wake-up calls to bolster China's naval presence on the African continent and less dependence on countries such as Greece, for example. When it comes to more recent issues, Keenan already outlined a time frame from which I will not detract nor add, but I will just speak about the qualitative aspect of this all, because I think this is quite important as well. South Africa will continue, yes, to some considerable degree to exercise some level of autonomy, so to say, because it doesn't explicitly rely on Chinese hardware. But then this will increasingly become challenged because of the rhetoric and the actions coming from within South Africa itself. I will refer, first of all, to Will for Peace, which was, I think, a postponed version, if I'm not mistaken, of MOSI 3, which was supposed to happen in November last year at a very awkward time when South Africa was supposed to host the G20. So they decided to postpone that. And I think it came under the guise of Will for Peace from 9 January this year and lasted for about 7 days. There was kind of a dissonance that I would urge our authors to look at, a disagreement of some sort between the South African Defence Force, the National Defence Force, and the executive, actually, the person of the president, actually, because of the presence of one country, Iran. So South Africa has done military exercises with Russia and with China, although with Russia it became increasingly awkward, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. But what made Will for Peace even more problematic was the presence of Iran and the rhetoric coming from the South African National Defence Force. Because the South African National Defence Force said Will for Peace was a BRICS Plus led initiative. And I think when Shannon and Keenan are trying to doubt South Africa's non-alignment, yes, you would do well to actually look at the rhetoric that was published by the South African National Defence Force, because it will actually lend credence to the fact that South Africa's continued claims to being a non-aligned power are actually stretching credibility at the moment, because obviously of the presence of Iran and Russia, apart from China, which has had a longer standing military exercise with South Africa. So that is one aspect that could come out of South Africa's close defense cooperation with China. Another important aspect that will come from this is that since mid 2024, South Africa is no longer run by one political party, the African National Congress. It is in a coalition government of national unity, with its biggest partner, which is the Democratic Alliance. Now, everyone knows, everyone who pays close attention to South Africa understands that the Democratic Alliance is a long-standing critic of South Africa's close relationship with China and South Africa's presence in the BRICS group of countries as well. This year, actually, when Will for Peace happened, the DA wrote a scathing criticism of South Africa, because it called China, Russia, and Iran rogue aligned military powers. So I think that is one challenge that South Africa will increasingly come across. And then if national institutes such as the South African National Defence Force are using language such as BRICS, and then they went on by the South African National Defence Force. After some backlash, President Ramaphosa decided to exclude Iran from Will for Peace, but the Defence Force defied that to some extent, because in as much as 3 Iranian vessels were marooned at Force Bay, one Iranian vessel reportedly took part in Will for Peace. So that kind of defied the president's mandate. So these are some of the things that the South African government will have to contend with, because obviously its biggest partner in government, the ANC's biggest partner in government, the DA, is likely to take issue with that. Another aspect, and this is now drawing me to the conclusion of my presentation, that the authors Shannon and Keenan might want to look at, is just the effect, or maybe they've done this in the paper, we'll see when it's eventually out, the effect that South Africa's close relationship with China is likely to have on initiatives that have involved Western powers, such as the African Aerospace Defense Expo. I think the United States has failed to participate in the Expo in its previous iteration. So what impact did China play in that? So that is something that our authors would want to look at. Drawing to a close, I'll just speak about methodological issues. Again, I think they did a reasonable job, and it's understandable, Shannon, when you say that the paper was mostly Afrocentric. That is understandable. When it comes to the delineation of findings, it would probably lend the paper a lot of weight if it were to delineate the findings according to the samples that were taken. For example, what was the inclination of former SNDF members, and probably an explanation of why non-incumbent were interviewed. The same could be done as well with international affairs experts. So the findings have to probably give a generic idea of what each and every one participant says there. In conclusion, I would end with two questions. The first, I think Keenan already alluded to this, by the way, by saying, by giving a speculative forecast, so to say. But would you then describe that South Africa and China are entering a golden era of defense diplomacy? That is one question that I will ask. And then the second, obviously, how is the United States, especially the United States' current political inclination and political instincts, is likely to lead China, South Africa, and the African continent, by the way, even further into what has been called China's orbit or China's sphere of influence? I guess this will also provoke some more debate in what will ensue in the question and answer session. Once again, thank you very much, and I look forward to reading your paper.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for your insightful comments and few questions. Let me turn over to Cobus.
Thank you so much, Yoon, and thank you so much to Keenan and Shannon for all of this work that you've done over so long. Like I've personally been following this process right from the beginning, and in addition to, as Yoon mentioned, that we were on the advisory panel together, but I was particularly advising Keenan and Shannon. So it was fantastic to see this coming to fruition now. Congratulations on this work. I think it's really interesting, really provocative paper. It raises really interesting questions. I think it points towards kind of larger issues that frame South Africa's international position, and that I think is particularly putting the country under a lot of stress right now. In that South Africa has always been a hinge country, right? Kind of like it's a hinge between different worldviews. Particularly, it's very strongly embedded in the Anglo-American world of the kind of Atlantic Alliance. South Africa, historically, particularly during the apartheid era, South Africa was a kind of a junior partner, in some of those kind of in that world. At the same time, South Africa has always been a very strong member of the kind of left internationalist world. Its legacy in fighting apartheid was also connecting it to China, to Cuba, to the Palestinian movement and so on. So South Africa has always been this kind of like, in the way that South Africa brings together two oceans, it also brings together these two different worlds. And that reality is now putting South Africa under a lot of pressure. And so I think Keenan and Shannon has really kind of effectively shown that all of this is happening, all of this kind of military outreach and military diplomacy is happening in the context of the country being geopolitically squeezed, kind of between two really rapidly developing and rapidly securitizing powers. I mean, the US and China has always been highly securitized powers, but they're becoming even more so right now. So I think that that's very valuable. I think it's also what I found very valuable in the paper is its focus on the experience of South African military personnel, and I would encourage further iterations of this paper to explore that kind of person to person connections that came through not only in the embedded both in the methodology of your interviews with this personnel, but then also the way that they reflected on the person to person aspect of the actual train, like the actual kind of exercise encounters and experiences with China. I think that there's a lot there that can be explored more. Um, so and that obviously, like as Emmanuel was also commenting on, the speaking, like focusing on the South African side, I think kind of is very valuable. And but later iterations of this work, particularly if you're interested in taking some of this research into into further kind of projects, I would encourage you to see if there's ways of also bringing in the Chinese side, kind of to discuss it more, to get this kind of more comprehensive portrait of what this encounter really was on the ground. And with it, then, kind of that I think brings in like further kind of insights into what the South African soft power element of, kind of this is. Like, because South Africa obviously has been promoting itself, particularly from the Mandela era, promoting itself as this human rights focused foreign policy. By now, it's very difficult to say what that really means in a South African context, particularly as South Africa's ability to provide kind of peacekeeping, kind of public goods to the continent is diminishing. So in this sense, I think the paper raises, kind of or implies an interesting, overlap between South Africa and China's position, in the sense that they both are on paper large kind of like participants in African peacekeeping. China obviously particularly under the auspices of the United Nations, but in reality they both quite that engagement is relatively limited. Certainly bigger on the Chinese side than South African side, but there's certain very kind of very real constraints, to both countries kind of larger involvement in African peacekeeping. So the paper raises kind of questions about how we should think about African kind of security provision, at a moment when when the kind of logic of US's kind of involvement has been undergoing some significant changes, kind of particularly around, for example, minerals for security deals that we're seeing between the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Trump administration now, and kind of some military intervention in Nigeria, for example. It raises questions now, I think, particularly at a moment when we're seeing very stark security challenges in places like Sudan. The paper raises larger questions about how we should think about kind of external powers in kind of in African peacekeeping, and how we should think about South Africa's role there, which is both embedded in Africa, but in some ways not typical of Africa. Kind of like in some ways South Africa has almost acted like in some cases like an external peacekeeping keeping kind of contributor, even though it's also embedded in Africa. And kind of, and now that role is shifting, it raises a lot of questions about this kind of South Africa relationship. So I think this paper has been very, very helpful for me to think about South Africa's position. I really congratulate you on this work, and I encourage you to take it further and to kind of deepen it further.
Thank you, Koba, so much for your comments. I'm going to go back to Keenan and Shannon to respond to the discussion's comments and questions, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So whichever one of you wants to go first.
Uh, thank you, Yun. I think thank you so much to Dr. Matambo and of course to Dr. Van Staden as well for the feedback. It's really helpful to us, especially as we're moving towards getting our piece published. And I think there's obviously, since we had written it in 2024, a lot has changed. And so in answering the question put forward by Emmanuel about whether we describe it as entering a global era of collaboration, I think Kubus will remember that it's something that we discussed with him at length, whether we were actually happy with that title. I think at the time, perhaps, and maybe Shannon can contribute more. At the time, I think we were more comfortable with using that title. But as time went on, and then we started seeing things like, minerals for security. And of course, as many of you may know, that South Africa's peacekeeping contribution in the last 12 months has diminished greatly. We're in the process, South Africa is in the process of withdrawing from MONUSCO. So that type of peacekeeping public good that Kuba speaks to is really diminishing. But do I think that diminishes our ability to collaborate with China in the exchange of knowledge that this SANDF has learned in peacekeeping operations? No. So maybe perhaps the title is somewhat more aspirational now than it was accurate when we wrote it. So I think that, are we entering the golden era of collaboration? I think the opportunity for us to do that is there, and that is somewhat informed by the changing of the guard in terms of how diplomacy is exercised globally. And then I'll just lastly, before I hand over to Shannon, speak to the will for peace. I think it's fair for us to call it a conundrum. I mean, we learned yesterday in the news that the president has now moved the inquiry from Department of Defense into the presidency. That raises multiple concerns for us, just about the hierarchy and how the hierarchy of power is operating at that level. So of course, where there is smoke, there normally is fire. And we'll wait to see what the outcome of the inquiry is. But at surface level, it doesn't look good with regards to the discipline of the South African National Defence Force. I'll hand over to Shannon. Thank you.
Thanks, Keenan, and thank you to both of our respondents. Your comments are incredibly helpful. And as Keenan said, we wrote this a while ago, so it's really great to get fresh perspectives and to get that mirror on your past thinking. So when it comes to the title, it actually came from a quote from the Chinese ambassador to South Africa in 2023. And what he was doing is that at the 25th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations, he said that the two countries were entering into this golden era. So we kind of used that quote as a launching pad. And I think what it does is it does speak to this focus of ours on the two countries using defense diplomacy almost as a sieve for their rhetoric, for their relationship. So that's really how the title came into being, and it does speak to that focus, but at the same time, it has that underbelly where the golden era really isn't golden. So and it isn't very material either. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think we do have to think about that further again. And then when it comes to the discussion about South Africa's non-alignment, I really appreciated Koba's framing of the two oceans and the hinge. And I think initially when we were beginning to write this paper, I remember being incredibly frustrated with a lot of the news media's reflections on South Africa's non-alignment. There's a lot of rhetorical base debates in the country. This even came from our participants, where there was a bit of confusion about what is non-aligned and what is non-alignment. From the participants, there was this feeling that we should be non-aligned, which means to not enter into conflict, to be that example to the world, to not align with a big power, and then what non-alignment means, specifically with the non-alignment movement. And I think that those tensions then emanate through the participants themselves, who were also brought up with these different worldviews. So we had some participants who come from the tradition of the Umkhonto weSizwe, and then we have other participants who come from the tradition of the former apartheid um, National Defense Force. So you have these clashes of these worldviews, and ultimately South Africa's Defense Force is an amalgamated experiment. And these hinges, as Cobus describes it, not only is in practice or personnel on the ground, but it extends all the way through. And it extends through this defense diplomacy sieve and into the foreign relations themselves. So how we navigate that is a whole it's a whole mess. And I don't think we've quite got to the point, even ourselves as the two researchers on this project, are really understanding it. But I really appreciate the framing because it did help. I think it'll help us trying to get to the meat of it. And then finally, I just wanted to reflect on part of what Keenan is describing with the latest round of exercises. I think there's also a lot there. I mean, he did allude to where there's smoke, there's fire, but the hinges that we're describing, these clashes, as I say, they do extend into the ANC, they do extend into a democratic state that is trying to find its feet. And I really did appreciate Dr. Matambo's reflections on South Africa becoming a coalition nation and the implications of that for its foreign policy. Because a lot of this emanates from a tradition of the ANC. So some of these conflicts are also a product of a maturing country trying to find its feet, with different conflicting notions of what it should be and how it should position itself in the world.
Thank you, Shannon and Keenan, for your responses. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. So I encourage our members of the audience to please go ahead and use the Q&A for any questions. And given that that's the situation, I wanted to actually go back to Henry, who had a couple thoughts and questions for Shannon and Keenan. So let me go over to you, Henry.
Hello, sorry, they're just questions. I'm not coming in with more reflections. There was plenty of very well-deserved complimentary reflections and advice already. But no, just thank you again for the great presentation and great research. A couple of things that, a couple of points you raised that really sparked my interest. One, I really loved that quote that you shared about South Africa bestowing legitimacy on China by virtue of its relationship. And it made me curious if you could talk a little bit more about what you think South Africa gains from its defense relationships with China. Is it something as concrete as capabilities or technology, or maybe even reassurances of Chinese military support for any specific interests in the region, or is it something broader than that you could speak to? And then number two, Shannon, actually, you started indirectly speaking to this question in a very interesting way, but I was curious if in your reflections just now a minute ago, but I was curious whether you encountered any interesting divergences of opinion depending on the group that you were talking to. And so I was wondering, for example, are the SANDF respondents more wary of deepening engagement based on their experiences so far, but maybe the security experts calling for more, but you started going into even the differences within the SANDF, which is even more interesting. So I was just wondering what those differences of opinions might have looked like and why and how.
And maybe before Keenan and Shannon answer those questions, I had a couple of my own thoughts as you were speaking. Perhaps I missed it um, because there was so many details in your research and your presentation, but I was wondering about the role of military to military training activities. I know that actually, one of the other reports that the USIP commissioned a couple years ago was some work that Paul Nantulia did about kind of comparing Chinese military training offerings and their take up by different African countries as compared to kind of US training opportunities. And if I recall, Paul Nantulia's conclusion was that, a lot of African countries take advantage of these Chinese training opportunities in large part because they're so plentiful, they're free. The visa processing is quick. Whereas, in terms of the quality of the training that they might get in China, the evaluation of the different participants in these training activities was that, if given that opportunity, they would prefer to be trained in the US, but those opportunities are fewer and far between. Visa issues, all kinds of other issues prevent even the US military from bringing more Africans to the US for these opportunities. So I'm wondering if you covered military to military training as part of the kind of soft power offerings of China and how these were reviewed by your participants. My other question is, I'm having difficulty formulating it, but having lived in South Africa for between 95 and 2010, I watched the evolution of a lot of the things that you're talking about. But I also got to see the evolution of the kind of relationship between China and South Africa. And as compared to Chinese relationships with other African countries, its relationship with South Africa is relatively new. It only started in 1998. And given that a lot of the media coverage referred to the relationship, at least in the first decade or so, as a love affair, right? They were kind of seen as really close, in large part because of the things that you said, right? Um, but I'm trying to connect that to the point that Kobus made about the fact that it's not just an ANC government anymore, it's a coalition government. And that's been an aspect of um, South Africa's kind of realities for a number of years now. I recall, the ANC government refusing to give the Dalai Lama visas to visit South Africa on a number of occasions. And the criticism that came not just from the opposition parties at the time, the Democratic Alliance and others, but from people within their own government, most notably the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, right? Um, and the criticism was that, South African government was kowtowing to China. And in my view, they were doing that unnecessarily. I guess I'm wondering, kind of based on your research now on these military aspects of the relationship, where on the spectrum are we now? The love affairs ended, the kind of golden era hasn't quite started. You see those opportunities, but in the broader scheme of things, in terms of the not just the military, but the broader relationship between South Africa and China, where do you see it now? And where do you see it potentially going, especially given we have another, two, almost 3 more years of the Trump administration in the United States? And I would open up that last question to Emmanuel and Kobus as well. But let me go back to Keenan and Shannon to respond to Henry. And yeah, then maybe if we have time to Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think I would immediately, there is one question that jumps out to me, and I immediately would like to answer it before deferring to Shannon. And Eunice, your question on the role of military to military training exercises. So one of the things we found during the course of our fieldwork was that, in fact, there aren't many instances in which there have been military to military training exercises or projects. Obviously, I speak about this as external to naval exercises or any multinational naval exercise. So as far as on a military to military level in terms of training, whether that be officer training courses or whatever it may be, in fact, we found that there isn't much collaboration along those lines. And one of our participants really helped us understand it better when he said that interoperability in terms of activities with the Chinese Navy, and sorry for context, he's a former rear admiral in the South African Navy. He spoke about how South Africa uses NATO standard equipment, whereas the Chinese Navy does not. And so, in far as training capacities can be shared with each other, it's very difficult because of the type of equipment that it's drastically different. What he went on to say, though, is that it is more beneficial for China in most instances to have those types of training encounters with South Africa so that they can gain a better understanding of the operability of NATO standard equipment. So yeah, to answer that question, that is an area where interoperability doesn't really meet this golden era of collaboration, and that's simply because of a difference in the standards of equipment. However, as he said, it is far more beneficial for the Chinese to learn about a submarine that we may have that may be of a similar standard to a German or other European submarine. So just on that question, then I'll defer to Shannon.
Add on that, there's also been a bit of controversy with South Africa sending officials to get specialized training. I think back in 2023, there was a report about the former security minister, was it Natin Kleko? Yeah. So he had a specialized unit that was trained in Beijing, and when they returned to South Africa, they almost functioned as a personal squad, loyal to the minister, and so and later the soldiers were dismissed. So there's also been a bit of controversy with that kind of training, which other African countries receive. So that's also an important thing to note. And I think this also comes back to the hinge point that I was making earlier. I think there's another party to this that's really important, and this speaks back to a little bit of history for those who don't know. So in South Africa's liberation struggle, you have two main forces, one led by the ANC and one led by the PAC. And the ANC was predominantly supported by the Soviet Union, whereas the PAC was predominantly supported by China. And at the time of the Sino-Russian split, it then meant that any kind of liberation forces were trained differently. And I think, I mean, this would be something for us to explore if we could speak to those people who were trained in the different traditions. It would be really useful. But we do see these kinds of splits within the ANC about who is our partner and who isn't. And part of this kind of this renewed relationship, what Yoon is speaking about, it only really came into being in the early 2000s, is because the ANC didn't have a relationship with China. It's something that they had to forge in democracy. And really defense diplomacy, what came from our participants, the Frigate going to China, all of this was a part of trying to make that relationship a reality. So I think that's really important. And I think speaking to one of Henry's questions about the divergences of opinion, well, that's kind of where you see it. South Africa is a mixture of many things, and it's a mixture of traditions, and where those traditions come from, who supported who, for what reasons. It's why our foreign policy is so difficult to navigate, because on the one hand, initially when we started to assert ourselves in this increasingly more multipolar world, you're also seeing us just reinforcing relationships that have always existed. And a lot of these relationships, and I think this is what Quibus's point earlier, why it's so valuable, were person to person, right? Because these people were trained in foreign lands by foreign people under different traditions. And now you come back and you bring them all together and they feel quite differently about things. The president might have a position on something, but that guy was, with that guy in the 80s. So it is a bit of a difficult thing to navigate. And I think we're seeing that come through in our defense forces. And I do agree. I think doing some more interviews and engaging with more personnel from these different training traditions would be really valuable. And then, what does South Africa gain from this relationship? Wouldn't we like to know? But really, more than anything, I think what South Africa does really well, when it does it well, is really asserting itself as a value-laden kind of middle power. And what we have seen, especially with our fair weather US friends, unfortunately, is that we do need to build these relationships. So South Africa's export markets have really taken a knock with President Trump's tariff measures, and China has come to the party and taken on all of South Africa's stone fruit. So this is an example of why this is what we gain from the relationship. The defense diplomacy part is really important because it was how a lot of this material relationship came apart, person to person, through these military exercises, through these exchanges, beyond just the economics of it all. But as we said and what we found in our paper, with our declining military capability, that tool is becoming a bit shallow. So we don't really know what it will look like in future. Yeah, so that's all I have to say. I don't know if Keenan, you have anything else to add?
No, I think you've answered the question of what South Africa gets from the relationship as best we can at this stage. But I think in understanding, I think South African foreign policy quite understands quite well the rise in multipolarity and in having good friends and good neighborliness. And so this exercise of defense diplomacy is just one of those elements of saying we realize that we enter into a multipolar world, and so we need friends throughout the world, and we cannot only be limited to engaging with Western powers or people who were formerly friends. And I mean, as Yoon says, the relationship is relatively new, so I think it's one that develops, and I think South Africa is trying to very much situate itself within this multipolar world. So I wouldn't have much more to add.
Can I just ask one hopefully simple question before I turn back to Emmanuel and Cobus, and that is, which other countries has South Africa participated in joint military training exercises or demonstration exercises with? I know there was some controversy about China and Russia at some point, but to the US, are there others?
So South Africa has quite regularly done military exercises with the Europeans, specifically the Germans. And that's obvious because of the NATO equipment, among other things. I can't recall the last time we did military exercises with the US. So it hasn't been something that we've used to further that relationship in a very long time, which is possibly like a gap in the paper which we haven't really addressed.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, back to Emmanuel and then Cobus.
Thank you very much, Prof, and thank you. That was fascinating, actually, to listen to. I will go, Prof, slightly to what you ended your first set of questions with. But then before then, I'll just once again just reflect on what Keenan and Shannon have done. I think it's tremendous work, especially the fact that a lot has changed from the time you were crafting your paper. Now we have a totally different situation, especially in the United States in particular. So I'm quite glad that you will let the passage of time to dictate how the paper will eventually look like. Prof, you had ended your first set of questions there by, reflecting on how South Africa has been accused of kowtowing to to China. And this brings in now the awkwardness that the ANC in particular finds itself in, because it was twice actually that Dalai Lama was refused that visa. One was actually for 3 times. Oh, Lord. One what actually was at the invitation of President Bishop Desmond Tutu, because he was supposed to give a speech about Nobel laureates. Something interesting though happened, and the IFP, which is a coalition partner of the ANC government, of the government at the moment, has invited Dr. Lobsang Sange to come to South Africa. He is the president of the Central Tibetan Administration. But what was clever about that was that Dr. Lobsang Sange is also an American citizen. So the United States the ANC government then was caught in a very naughty and complex dilemma. And they were forced to bring him here, because how do you deny an American, right? And he presented a paper at Stellenbosch University, and the Chinese government protested outside the venue, and then the Chinese embassy as well reacted quite firmly to the South African government. I'm bringing that up because I want to juxtapose it to the behavior of other smaller African countries that have exercised more leverage, more agents in their relations with China. To the northwest of South Africa is Botswana, a very small country in terms of population, in terms of its GDP as well. Its previous president, Ian Khama, invited the Dalai Lama to go to Botswana. At the time, Botswana has relations with China. Unfortunately, the Dalai Lama could not come because of exhaustion, so it wasn't really on Botswana side. And after leaving the presidency, he actually visited the Dalai Lama. So that just gives the juxtaposition there of where South Africa has been looked upon as being too eager, so to say, to please China. And I'm afraid if the temperament of the current United States government will remain as it is, and I know this might be an awkward topic, but it remains as it is, then we will see a situation where a lot of countries will want to have closer relationships with countries that are looked upon as being more level-headed, and countries that are looked upon as being more predictable, so to say. And obviously, the talk right now among us international relations experts is, does South Africa wait out the current administration in the United States, or does it look for permanent solutions elsewhere, even if there would be a return to what has come to be known as the normal in the United States? Thank you, Prof, once again.
Thomas?
Yeah, not much to add, because it's just such a kind of a rich kind of engagement from everyone. I think it is useful, particularly as as Yoon was pointing out, like the historical relationship is relatively new. So even though kind of as Shannon was referring to, there are these kind of long-standing historical relationships between the former Soviet Union and so on, and South African officials. There's less of a widespread lived person-to-person relationship with China, like that stretches into South Africa's history. So I think it is important, kind of in looking at South Africa's position, to make a distinction between South Africa's real relationship with China and the rhetorical or discursive role that China plays in South Africa's larger disputes with the West. So South Africa has very strong, very fundamental, ongoing, unresolved conflicts with Western power. Partly because Western power was very complicit in propping up apartheid. So kind of like through the Reagan like until the end of the Reagan era, the Reagan and Thatcher era, kind of like Euro America, kind of or particularly the Anglo-American alliance propped up apartheid. And there remains unresolved conflicts, kind of between South Africa and, kind of and Western power around this history. And so China then China functions almost as a rhetorical, like almost like as a kind of a empty signifier almost in, kind of in that, kind of in that larger kind of conflict. And I think Shannon and Keenan's work has been really helpful, actually, in kind of in showing how important the language of international international governance reform, for example, is in building a bridge between these two countries that actually don't know each other very well. So there is a, kind of on the basis of China is an alternative power to the BRICS. China is, or an alternative power to the West. The BRICS represents alternative structures to the West. China is supporting South African positions in calling for international governance reform. Those kind of like rhetorical spaces sometimes provide an alternative space to the actual China South Africa relationship, kind of which remains in some ways more complicated, sometimes more distant. Sometimes there's a lot of miscommunication between the actual South African and Chinese governments, even as they are pulling together so much more closely. I think now, as South Africa is going through the tariff process, new spaces for real cooperation have been opened up very rapidly. Kind of so as Shannon was talking, like agricultural trade is one key field that has emerged in the last few months. Chinese investment in the auto sector in South Africa is another one. And so we're seeing the development of these kind of spaces of close, real relationship, which maybe points towards a kind of a commercial basis for, kind of for this relationship going forward. At the same time, China is leaning rhetorically very heavily into self solidarity, shared modernization, like, kind of global, the importance of UN Security Council reform, like global governance reform, and so on. So China knows that this rhetoric, kind of like is powerful in the global South generally, but particularly powerful in South Africa. And so I think it's important for us to keep a tab on both of these axes. They're not necessarily the same thing. And I think, what I think, kind of just to end, I think the paper is very helpful in highlighting what Yushen Wu has been referring to. She's a colleague of Emmanuel at University of Johannesburg. And she's worked on China-Africa relations for a long time, but she's also, particularly at the moment, she's looking at oceans work, particularly in relation to the Indo-Pacific, different conceptions of the Indo-Pacific, where of course China and the United States play very large roles, and South Africa is this kind of like embedded, kind of in this embedded geographical position, kind of in that world. So what she has been pointing out is, what has come to be known as, in somewhat ableist language, as oceans blindness kind of in South Africa, like where so there's a kind of a like South African kind of foreign policy thinking kind of like falls off where it reach at the beach, kind of, and it has difficulty of thinking of its oceans, and it's particularly its very complicated positionality in sitting onto oceans, linking the Atlantic world to the Indian Ocean world. Kind of there's not enough kind of foreign policy thinking in South Africa around this reality. And China is really key to it. And there's these kind of military engagements with China on a naval space is particularly important, kind of around these issues. So, so I think, kind of in going forward, I think this paper really provides a very valuable kind of like base camp, kind of from which I think Keenan and Shannon can really kind of then kind of go upwards, towards, up the mountain, kind of to really kind of like deal with more of these issues, because I think there's really a lot to work with here.
Thank you so much, Kobus. I just want to give one final opportunity. If anyone else has anything to say, you can just turn off your mic. You're more than welcome. We have a little bit of time. And I think this is a first for the Africa China Initiative in this webinar space where we have no comments or questions from the audience. So I'm kind of reliant on our panelists. So anybody have anything final that they want to say? Okay. If that's the case, I want to take this opportunity, thank all of you for being here and to thank our audience for joining us. I know that in this crazy world that we live in, there are so many demands on your time, and we really appreciate that you've taken a bit of time to join us this morning, this afternoon. Um, We got a couple thank yous from different audience members. And again, thank you to the audience. Thank you to our panelists. I think this sharing new research, especially new research carried out by early career scholars like yourselves, Keenan and Shannon, um, and research that does such a deep dive into not just a bilateral relationship. You know, we often talk about Africa-China relations in the macro, and doing this kind of deep dive is so important to understanding the nuances, but also not just a deep dive in South Africa-China relationships, but also like a particular aspect of this relationship is so helpful. I agree with Kobus in helping us kind of unpack and understand so much of what's going on, in particular around, for me at least, the power dynamics that we know are there, but often have a difficult time kind of understanding kind of how they play out. So again, thank you. I wish you both luck as you kind of finish up. You know, I add some of these comments and responses to questions in the final iteration. Let us know if you need help with publishing it because it deserves to be out there and deserves a wider readership and audience. Thank you all again for joining us. We have another webinar coming up next month in our monthly webinar series, and the next one is also going to be based with scholars in South Africa. Emeka Emeji's new book on Chinese and African media between influence operations and decolonization will be the focus of next month's event. Please keep an eye on this space. We'll be sending out more information about that in the coming weeks. Again, thank you all so much for being here with us. And yes, we hope to see you next month.